a project. This is the Google Hangout with Senator John Cornyn. This is a project of the Vets for Cornyn organization. Strongly encourage fellow veterans to be involved. This is an important organization, important to have our voice represented in the debate for U.S. Senate here in Texas. My name is James Burnson. I'm a Vice President of Crosswind Communications out of Austin. I'm a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2007-2008 in the multinational Corps Iraq. And I'd like to get started and let Senator Cornyn start by giving some brief remarks.
Well, thanks, James, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in. This is a very important initiative, Vets for Cornyn. Obviously, veterans issues have become very much front and center in the news recently. Unfortunately, that's because of some of the mistreatment and indeed what appears to be not only bad management, but possibly even illegal conduct at a number of veterans facilities around the country, primarily surrounding manipulation of the appointment times. And indeed, we learned in Phoenix of a report of 40 veterans who may have lost their lives waiting on a secret waiting list, which was designed to avoid the scrutiny that would come with the backlogs at that facility. Now we've seen about 26 different veterans facilities around the country implicated. We've had a number of whistleblowers come forward making a variety of allegations that need to be investigated thoroughly. I've asked the FBI director to actually undertake a criminal investigation. Anytime you start hearing of reports of destroyed evidence, I think that gives rise to the potential for federal crimes, federal criminal conduct. And of course, I was one of the ones who early on called for the resignation of Secretary Shinseki, something that happened last Friday. This is not something that should happen to our veterans, and certainly not something any of us, regardless of partisan affiliation, should accept. So I hope that now with the resignation of Secretary Shinseki, that we'll see the sort of top-to-bottom investigation of these allegations, and we'll do whatever is necessary in order to restore our commitment to our veterans, that provide them the services, the benefits that they have earned by virtue of their freedom, by virtue of their service for our freedom. So with that, James, I'll pause and I know I'll kick it back to you.
Great, and thank you. And for those watching, here attending on this video conference with me is John Gabriel, a Navy veteran, blogger, and communications consultant. We also had Honorable Alan Clark, who is he's a former military intelligence officer and author. He was unable to join due to technical issues, so I will be asking his questions on his behalf. But before I get started, let John introduce him.
Hi, I'm John Gabriel. As James said, I'm a Navy veteran. I thank the Senator for addressing these issues and for calling for the resignation of Mr. Shinseki. It is a disappointment. I am a Navy veteran and I live in the Phoenix area, so I've had experience with the Phoenix VA. Thankfully not as tragic as some of our brothers in arms had to deal with. But I thank you very much for just paying attention, shining a light on these issues, because too often our veterans are forgotten, especially once the troops come home.
Great, thank you. Now, I guess let me get started with a quick question to Senator Cornyn. In light of General Shinseki's resignation, what's the next step? Do we have to go through the entire process of selecting a replacement, going through the Senate vetting process? If so, is the reform going to have to wait until that process gets forward, or what can we do in the meantime to get the process started?
Well, there is an acting head of the Veterans Affairs Administration, and somebody who I hope will pick up the baton and begin this process. But it's obviously also going to include Congress and the executive branch, headed by the President. to acknowledge that we have a serious problem here and not try to just kick it under the rug or kick it down the road. We know that there already were long backlogs in the processing of claims, some 589,000 claims in the system, more than half of which were backlogged according to the VA's own criteria. And I think the risk was, and it is that people have become desensitized to this issue and willing to accept this as a new normal, which we should not do. And it took these allegations arising out of Phoenix and Texas and other places around the country of cooked books, of destroyed evidence, and people potentially even losing their lives awaiting the treatment that they deserve, for the public to become engaged. So I think Secretary Shinseki leaving and new leadership being part of the answer. What we need to do is make sure we understand the depth and breadth of the problem, so we can make sure we can respond in an appropriate way, in a way that keeps that commitment to our veterans. So we're just really at the beginning of this, as far as I'm concerned. We need to get to the bottom of it.
Thank you, sir. John, did you want to ask some questions related to that?
Yes, I had a few questions on it. Now that we know that General Shinseki has stepped down, how probable is it that other responsible VA executives around the country will be fired or at the very least disciplined? One of the concerns is bureaucracy has grown so great, all the people that veterans never even see made obviously horrible errors in judgment and in ethics. And what do you think the fallout will be for those executives still working on the day-to-day operations?
Well, John, last week the House of Representatives passed a bill that would provide more accountability for folks at the mid and lower levels in the VA organization. One of the problems with the VA right now is it's one of the largest government agencies in the country. Over 300,000 people are work at the Veterans Administration. And unfortunately, because many of the arrangements, the collective bargaining agreements between the public employee unions and the government, it's very hard to hold people accountable for not doing their job. And one of the most important things we can do, I think, is restore that accountability. The House, as I said, passed a bill that would allow broader discretion to fire people who aren't doing their jobs. That now is up to the Senate to see if Senator Reid, the majority leader of the Senate, will in fact take that bill up. I would personally be very pleased if he did, but I would be somewhat surprised. I think you'll see Senator Sanders, Bernie Sanders, the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, is reportedly coming out with a much broader piece of legislation that I know we're just beginning to look at. But one of the things that has been suggested that I'd be interested in hearing from some of our viewers on is the idea that Senator Coburn, Senator Burr, and Senator McCain have proposed, and that is providing, especially when the treatment does not involve a specialty that the VA has gotten very good at, things like treating PTSD, traumatic brain injury, to deal with things like amputations and prosthetic replacement from IEDs, where it does not involve these sort of specialty areas where the VA is clearly world class, but let's say ordinary sorts of illnesses in medical care, whether we ought to give the veterans a card so that if they're delayed because of long waiting lists or they have to travel 100 miles, 200 miles to get seen at a VA facility, whether they would have the option, subject to their choice, to have a private health provider in their community provide those services. So I think you're going to see a number of proposals come out of this, but the most important thing I think we can do is get to the bottom of this current scandal so we can understand it, and so we're not just sort of putting icing on an otherwise rotten system that doesn't serve the needs of our veterans.
Senator, a lot of veterans, such as myself, who are in the private sector now working, have health insurance in the private sector. We have our regular health care, so we're not dependent on VA as some of the older veterans are. But on the one hand, we see the Obamacare and the expansion of healthcare into the private sector. And our fear is the problems in the VA are going to multiply in other sectors. And rather than learn the lessons and improve the VA, what we're going to see is the same problems start to creep into the private healthcare system as well.
Well, James, this is government-run healthcare, and a sense is that the bureaucrats, when they can't keep up with the demand and the appointments, they simply have off the books lists of people waiting for care, and some, if the facts prove to be true of the Phoenix allegation, they end up losing their life because they can't get access to care. We've had reports from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas by one whistleblower said that colonoscopies, routine cancer screening, were not performed without extraordinary delay. And of course, the point is that I think you're making and that I'm trying to make is that government-run health care, even if it's VA or it's in the private sector, I think we ought to exercise a reasonable degree of skepticism about the competence and the ability of a large bureaucracy, including that of the VA, to deliver that care as we promised. The most important thing, I think, is to make sure that we can keep our promises and our commitments to our veterans. And right now, if we're learning that the VA system is not doing that, and I would be very reluctant to expand that same dysfunctional system to private health care as well. And that's what I think we're possibly looking at.
Senator, Honorable Alan Clark, who is going to participate but was unable to, had one question he asked. Is it possible for veterans who submit claims for service-connected disabilities to be kept on active duty until the VA decides how to deal with their case?
Well, I'm sorry Alan couldn't join us today. He's on my Service Academy vetting board, and a great American, great patriot. What Alan's referring to is that what we learned after the Iraq War and the Afghan War started is that there was a lack of communication and coordination between the active duty military and the VA. And indeed, they were using different criteria to judge disability and the like. And that the records were slow to change hands. And that has been something that we've tried to improve. And certainly, I think trying to make sure that there is no gap in the treatment of service-connected disabilities from active duty service to the VA ought to be our goal. That continues to be a work in progress, but as you can tell, there are a number of different problems with the VA system, and that was one that we were familiar with and trying to address, but now the subsequent events seem to have overwhelmed our ability to deal with that one. But we can't forget trying to eliminate the gap between active duty military service and the treatment for those service-connected injuries or illnesses and their transition to the VA system. It should be seamless with no gap.
Thank you. John, did you want to ask any more questions?
Yes, and I just wanted to make a note too. One of the things that was outrageous to me was the colonoscopy screenings being delayed. My grandfather and mother both passed away due to easily detectable colon cancer, and just the fact that our veterans can't even get this if they try, a very common procedure, is quite disturbing. I was wondering, you did mention there could be a chance of legislation to allow veterans to seek care from private doctor, especially if the VA is unable to accommodate them. I'd love to see that expanded, and it seems like something that most people would get behind, regardless of ideology. Do you think that would have a solid chance looking at a Barack Obama presidency, or would he just downplay the potential there?
Well, I think, John, this kind of change, and I would call it a reform, to give veterans choices about where to seek their health care, to me seems like a common sense way to address the backlog at a lot of VA facilities, the unnecessary unnecessarily long wait periods, and just the outright refusal to provide things like the colonoscopy screenings that you alluded to a moment ago. So if a veteran could go to any local healthcare provider in their community and do that, it strikes me as a good choice for those who want to choose that. And in Texas, for example, our veterans in the Rio Grande Valley, which is a considerable distance away from Audie Murphy Veterans Hospital in San Antonio, have long expressed concerns about the travel required to get from the Rio Grande Valley to the Audie Murphy Hospital. If they could get that care in their community by a provider that they were comfortable with, then strikes me as a good choice. So I hope this does not get caught up in what I can begin to see might be some of the rhetoric about privatization or vouchers. This would be about providing veterans choices, but we're going to need to hear from the veterans all across the country who've told the stories that we've heard reported here recently about the dysfunction at the VA to say this is an option they would like. We're not talking about the sorts of conditions where the VA has extraordinary competence, like dealing with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or traumatic brain injury, or centers of excellence in dealing with IED injuries and amputations and the prostheses that are used to replace those limbs. Those are areas that obviously the VA has accomplished a lot in terms of its state-of-the-art healthcare delivery. But if it's ordinary illnesses and things that our veterans would like to access healthcare through their private practitioner in their community, then it makes sense to me that we ought to provide them that option.
Thank you, sir. And one of the things I think that's very important to note is that the greatest generation, the number of veterans who are using the services was large, and that's part of the reason why I guess we're in the problem now, because they're reaching that age where they require a lot of the service, and we want to have that available for them. But for my generation, it's the number of people who served in the military is not really as large, and just the cost effectiveness or the number of people who are using the system is not going to be that large. So having that option for my generation, I think, would be a very beneficial thing. Now, you mentioned...
If I could just interrupt you there and say, I had a Veterans Roundtable in Houston last week, and a number of the veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq made exactly the same point you did, and I think it's an important one. But number of these same veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan made the point that they were becoming so discouraged by long waiting periods or refusal to deal with their needs that they just have given up. Either they've given up trying to get treatment, which can be very dangerous in the case of somebody experiencing post-traumatic stress syndrome or some other non-visible injury, especially if they begin to self-medicate with drugs or alcohol. And we all know that the incidence of suicide among returning veterans is unacceptably high. And, of course, the dangers are pretty apparent. But I think giving people a chance and a choice to be seen by a healthcare provider on a more timely basis just makes a lot of sense. But I think your point is well made, and that is there may well be a generational difference of opinion in terms of who decides to access that choice. But it should be up to the veteran to make the decision.
Well, John, did you want to ask another question?
The only remaining question I had, and this could be a little more complicated because once again we're talking about the layers of bureaucracy, which, as we know, throughout the government, and since I've been at the Phoenix VA, it's kind of how the worst critics of government health care and completely government-provided single-payer health care, the worst criticisms they have. I went there right as I got out of the Navy. I went to college, paid my way through, and if I would have something like a severe cold or something, I'd go to the VA and be there 8 hours to get over-the-counter medication. So it was kind of, obviously, my issues were very minor compared to the vast majority of veterans who really rely on that care. One of my concerns is, at least in the initial reporting, it said that a lot of the numbers and the books were cooked, basically, in part to ensure that VA executives received bonuses. And is there any possible way that these bonuses could be returned since they were procured through fraud?
Yes, that's certainly, to me, one of the most egregious parts about this scandal is that that the cooking of the books was done so that senior executives in the VA system could get a bonus. First of all, mark me up as a skeptic on whether government officials ought to be getting bonuses in the first place for doing their job. We're all familiar with the role of bonuses in the private sector, where if the bottom line is better as a result of the work of the workforce, then the employer decides to share some of the benefits of that as a way to incentivize people to do even more and work even harder. But I have problems with this idea as across the board with government employees. But yeah, the whole point is that if people procure those bonuses through fraud, as you point out, or through, let's take it a step further, possibly even criminal conduct being involved, not by them, but they were benefited from it, then I think there's plenty of ways that Congress can come back and say, you didn't deserve that bonus for one or more reasons, and claw that back. I think that's certainly something we ought to look at.
Senator Cornyn, do you think that should the evidence rise to this, should some of these people go to prison or be punished in some way judicially for what they did in falsifying those records?
Yeah, well, James, that's why I've called for the investigation by the FBI. They are the premier law enforcement investigative agency in the U.S. government, and last week we had James Comey, the FBI director, before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I asked him whether he had been contacted by the White House or anyone in authority at the federal government and asked to investigate some of these allegations, which are very serious, as we've discussed. And he told me, at least at that time, he had not been requested to even start an investigation. So I hope this additional publicity and public pressure and concerns by veterans will influence the White House's and the executive branch's decision in that regard, and that we will have that kind of investigation. And let's get the facts and let the chips fall where they may.
Sorry. Great, Senator Cornyn. Those are all the questions that we had at the moment. John, unless you have any other questions, I'd like to turn it over to the Senator for a final statement.
No more questions here, but thanks again for shining a light on this issue, Senator.
Well, James and John, thank you for those questions, and Alan Clark in absentia, thank you for his question. I just hope those of you who are watching and listening will let your elected representatives know in Texas or around the country about your concern for our veterans. This to me is not just about keeping our commitment. That's important, and that's something that we should all try to do every day. But to me, there is a higher calling involved here as well. People who have put themselves in harm's way, families who've paid the ultimate sacrifice to keep our country and us free. To me, this is a moral obligation and imperative. That's why I think so many people are completely outraged by what they're hearing. But I know the tendency here in Washington is to do a news dump on Friday, which is what happened with Secretary Shinseki's resignation, and to hope that they have avoided all the bad press and the blowback. We can't let this issue drop, which is why we need to continue to press for a thorough investigation, including a criminal investigation, and then we need to let the chips fall where they may, as I said earlier. And then we need, under the auspices of new leadership, to rebuild the VA system so that it's one that's transparent and accountable, and we can basically prove to ourselves and to the world that we're keeping our commitments to our veterans. So thank you for this opportunity to join you on the Google Hangout and to answer a few questions. And thanks for kicking off Veterans for Cornyn as we are doing here today. And I'd invite any of you to join us on our website or Twitter or Facebook We're always glad to hear from you and get your comments and concerns.
Well, thank you, Senator Cornyn, and thank you everyone who's joined us. I think this is a very important opportunity for veterans to have their voice heard. I know the Cornyn campaign is very open, and as they should be, as all our elected officials should be, because they represent us, and our voice is important, and they want to hear it. So please, for all those who watched, I'm sure there are many questions that we didn't ask that you want to ask. I'm sure if you reach out to the Cornyn campaign, then we'll have that information. Please visit the website, vetsforcornyn.com, or sorry, Senator JohnCornyn.com is the website. Please visit that, and there's a link there for Vets for Cornyn on the website. And thank you very much for joining us, and that is it for now. Thank you.